to introduce Chris Winks. He is Associate Professor and Chair of Comparative Literature at Queens College, City University of New York. He is the author of Symbolic Cities in Caribbean Literature, published by Palgrave in 2009. And he has published articles, reviews, and translations from French and Spanish in various journals and edited collections. He is also the editor and co-translator with Adriana Gonzalez Mateos of Los Danzantes del Tiempo, a bilingual English-Spanish anthology of Kamau Brathwaite's poems that received the 2011 Casa de las Americas Prize. Chris's current translation projects include Labyrinth, a bilingual English-Spanish anthology of the selected writings of Cuban poet Lorenzo Garcia Vega, and that is forthcoming by Junction Press. And also the poetry of Haitian surrealist Magloire Saint-Aude. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to our keynote speaker, Chris Winks. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and it may not be afternoon for some of you who may be in other parts of the world. Before anything else, I would like to extend my warmest thanks to the co-organizers of this conference, Professors Alexandra, Coller, and Amin Erfani, my CUNY colleagues, who have worked very hard during these crisis and pandemic-ridden times to ensure its realization, and to all the presenters for their contributions and their presence, however virtual. I feel a little abashed coming after an entire day of presentations that have definitely, got me thinking. I hope that this can do the same for you. This conference, like others of its focus and scope, is further proof, if such proof were needed, that translators, once dismissed by hiring and tenure committees in universities as a fundamentally unscholarly endeavor on the intellectual level, say, of solving a crossword puzzle, is no longer a marginal concern and indeed involves vital cultural matters whose implications extend well beyond academic precincts. I am also thankful to Professors Coller and Erfani for inviting me to give this talk. If this event were being held in the Hispanophone world, my intervention would be labeled a conferencia magistral, which conjures up images of an expert wrapping herself or himself in the cloak of authority, magister dixit, and bestowing snatches of what might pass for accumulated wisdom on a receptive or indifferent public. My purpose here, however, is not to proclaim mastery, other than perhaps in the guise of a magister ludi, but to bring up in relatively disorderly form a few questions about translation that I am sure, in fact, now I know, all of you have had to confront in your own thought and practice. In this context, then, I do prefer the word keynote to describe my contribution here, particularly owing to its musical associations. For what characterizes a literary translation at its best is, among other qualities, a sensitivity to the music of the source text, particularly where poetry is concerned, without, for that matter, being constrained to strive for a chimerical accuracy. And while my talk will not, nor should it, be devoid of dissonance and abrupt key changes, since to speak of translation is to speak of a certain dissonant relation to the original text, that is, to the extent a word like original applies, since a translation is itself an original of sorts. Well, I hope this will strike at least a few sympathetic notes and chords. A few words about the title of the talk. I'm sorry, it's all sounding like an extended throat clearing here. About the title of the talk, Translation, the Impossible Necessity. I had thought myself quite clever in coming up with the phrase that follows the inevitable in academic papers, colon. In fact, I carried it around with me for years, waiting for an opportune time to use it. Then, while reading over some key texts about the theory and practice of translation, I found this very phrase in Joseph F. Graham's translation of Jacques Derrida's classic essay, Des Tours de Babel, itself an untranslatable phrase because of the wordplay in there. Nothing new under the sun, unless, of course, this was a return of the graduate school coursework repressed, but adding a question mark to the formulation at least serves to accentuate its open-endedness. Basing his essay on the Old Testament tale of the Tower of Babel and the divine curtailment of its construction, Derrida, among other observations, declares that God, in his action of imposing and opposing his name to the tower builders, quote, destines them to translation. He subjects them to the law of a translation both necessary and impossible. In a stroke with his translatable, untranslatable name, he delivers a universal reason, but he simultaneously limits its very universality, forbidden transparency, impossible univocality. And Yahweh, or Yod-He-Vav-He himself, is not free from this double bind, as Derrida wittily points out, quote, he has not finished pleading for the translation of his name, even though he forbids it. For Babel is untranslatable. God weeps over his name. His text is the most sacred, the most poetic, the most originary, since he creates a name and gives it to himself, but he is left no less destitute in his force, and even in his wealth, he pleads for a translator. To speak of untranslatability is a contested matter. Derrida proclaims in another essay, Monolingualism of the Other, in a sense, nothing is untranslatable, but in another sense, italics, everything is untranslatable. Translation is another name for the impossible, unquote. The immense, indeed indispensable project helmed by the French classical philosopher, she would prefer to be called a sophist in the ancient Greek sense, Barbara Cassin, known in its English version as Dictionary of Untranslatables and in its original French version as Vocabulaire européen des philosophies, Dictionnaire des intraduisibles, develops Derrida's challenge to a univocal logocentrism by taking on the Aristotelian disdain for linguistic ambiguities, équivoque in French, and homonyms, which allegedly introduce confusion where clarity and transparence should reign, and sets forth the multiplicity of nuances, conceptual and semantic, that philosophical and literary keywords take on as they cross languages and cultures. In what could be called a theoretical pendant to this ongoing dictionary project, Éloge de la traduction, in praise of translation, Cassin emphasizes that what presents itself as untranslatable actually invites retranslations and counterposes such efforts to the deceptive transparency of globish, that bureaucratic newspeak, which is the cornerstone not only of classes in so-called business English, but increasingly in global communications. Who needs machine translation when today's financiers, bureaucrats, and CEOs, regardless of their birth languages, can be trained to think and write as globish spouting machines? The banality of evil that results from the mechanical imposing itself on the human and reducing everything to the binary of input and output. Cassin tells a revealing anecdote about being rebuffed by an EU functionary when she requested funding for the Dictionnaire. Translation, we only fund computer translations. Against this false cyber-imposed universality, Cassin declares, this is my translation, I've never encountered language, I've only encountered languages, citing an aphorism of Wilhelm von Humboldt, one of Noam Chomsky's influences. Language manifests itself within reality solely as diversity. Proudly asserting her condition as a barbarian in the Greek sense, literally a child of Babel, as one who refuses to see a single language, Greek, as the language of philosophizing and of logos, unlike Heidegger, for whom Greek is the philosophic alpha and omega, closely followed, unsurprisingly, by German. But it should be added here that some scholars have severely criticized Heidegger's translations from ancient Greek as distorted and misleading. Cassin demands that we need to think in terms of languages, unquote, their differences, the more than one language, in quotes, that serves as Derrida's definition of his method. This requires taking up metaphorical arms against the so-called universal, which is always and everywhere colonialist in intent and dependent for its ideological legitimacy on effacing the fact that it was constructed on the ruins of other ways of seeing and thinking. Further, Cassin advocates taking as our point of departure, not concepts, but words. For her, there is only a short distance between that Anglo-American analytical philosophy which subordinates the word to the concept and the plight of Globish, the plague of Globish, our plight to be caught in it. No more, quote, regime of ontology and phenomenology, unquote, rather the domain of performance, which makes what is said into being, fait être ce qui est dit. This leads to what Cassin calls a consequential relativism that refuses all universals. She makes a qualified exception for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and chooses to measure truth rather than simply affirm it. She's taking that from Gorgias, the sophist. And rejects the principle of non-contradiction so dear to the likes of Aristotle and his intellectual heirs. Translations are labors rather than results. There is no final or definitive translation, and pretensions to the contrary are misplaced. Likewise, languages are always in movement, resisting imprisonment in dictionaries. The Dictionary of Untranslatables has evolved from its initial French edition into versions in numerous languages. Hence, there is no master lexicon. And translation occupies a third space or domain. It is not a matter of a binary of source and, the aggressiveness of the word is revealing, target language. Whatever our natal, I'm bristling with scare quotes here, whatever our natal language or languages may be, translation as performance serves as a relativizing force and brings us up against the limitations and possibilities of not only the languages we live and work and play in, but of the languages we have studied. And this is what is so pernicious about the depreciation of language study in this country. The United States, the US of A, speak American, everybody. Despite the salutary lack of an official language, the imposition of English, a certain Banosic English, conceived of as assimilative pressure to exist in a culturally impoverished realm where the only thing that counts, the quantitative word is also revealing, is what conforms to narrowly utilitarian criteria said to befit the totally administered pseudo-citizen of neoliberalism. I will get off my Adornian high horse in just a second. Eppure la traduzione si muove. But precisely how it does this partakes, ideally I'd say, of what could be called the ineffable, the third liminal space between languages I mentioned earlier. As a text, under the translator's hand, slowly takes on another linguistic incarnation, often coming up against seemingly intractable knots and obstacles, words whose cultural and semantic overtones admit of no easy transmutation, idiomatic colloquial expressions without equivalents elsewhere. The list of pitfalls is long. I am always reminded of the spell cast by Oberon, king of the fairies, on the rude mechanic Nick Bottom Weaver in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, which coincidentally or not, was mentioned earlier today. As you know, Oberon, in a fit of pique against his wife Titania, enlists his trickster Lieutenant Puck to turn Bottom's head into that of an ass, so that Titania will promptly fall in love with him once she awakens from her ensorcelled slumber. Shocked at the sight of his mutated comrade, Peter Quince the carpenter, the usually officious director of the play within the play for which he has assembled his cast of mechanicals, exclaims, "Bless thee, Bottom, bless thee, thou art translated." Quite aside from the likelihood that anyone embarked on a translation of a difficult text at some point comes to feel like a donkey, experiencing equal parts stupidity and stubbornness in the face of the challenge, the comedy of Bottom's predicament resides in his being completely unaware of his physical transformation, which, while it has left him with the powers of speech, slowly begins to take over his appetites and sensations. Nothing daunted, Titania embraces him, and one would imagine does more than that, and both fall asleep. Later, once released from the spell, Bottom, who is a weaver, one would expect to be some manner of storyteller, tries to assimilate what he has just experienced in his translated, I use paper, translated form. Quote, "I have had a dream. Past the wit of man to say what dream it was. Methought I was, there is no man that can tell what." In his original state, he cannot find words for his translation and resolves to ask Quince to write a ballad, a musical composition of his dream. "It shall be called Bottom's Dream because it hath no bottom." In other words, he was not himself during his dream, but at the same time, he cannot get to the bottom, so to speak, of his experience. And though he wants to discourse wonders to his fellows and tell you everything right as it fell out, he avoids doing so by commanding them, "Ask me not what." The man praised by one of his comrades for having the best wit of any handicraft man in Athens is reduced to speechlessness, or rather merely to the rehearsed speech of his role as the tragic lover Pyramus, which for all its comic excess cannot entirely be divested of his haunting by his amorous entanglement with the queen of the fairies. His erstwhile translation is beyond words. Might we compare his condition, toute proportion gardée, to Walter Benjamin's famous statement on pure language, which no longer means or expresses anything, pure language, this is the quote, "Pure language, which no longer means or expresses anything, but is, as expressionless and creative word, that which is meant in all languages. All information, all sense, and all intention finally encounter a stratum in which they are meant to be extinguished." And by extension, could this apply to the existential predicament of all translators? It would be easy enough to segue from here into praise of the utopian possibilities that the dream and actuality of translation can instantiate. At the same time, though, it is important not to uncritically celebrate translation, which, like every other undertaking in capitalist society, is potentially and too often actually complicit with oppression. In her important study, just published last year by Éditions du Seuil, Traduction et Violence, Translation and Violence, Tiffaine Samoyol criticizes what she sees as Barbara Cassin's excessively Irenic view of translation when measured against the different forms of violence that all acts of translation bring into play within a post/neo-colonial world. Aside from the inevitable syntactical and conceptual violence meted out on the source text in the process of translation, suppressing rhymes, altering metrical schemes, changing proper names, replacing idioms with approximately comparable ones in the language of arrival, in short, imposing, however unavoidably, a foreignness external to the text, the peril of domesticating the source text in the interests of accessibility or smoothness is ever present. And it is certainly aggravated, not alleviated, when authors in, say, languages other than English write in such a way as to facilitate translation into that now global language, thereby boosting their market profile. So what is labeled as untranslatable, as Samoyol observes, can often become an excuse for not translating at all, at least where marginalized languages are concerned. including those spoken by millions like Kannada and Hausa, which in their context do exert a certain hegemony over other ethnic groups and their languages. Keep in mind also that translators have often been, however ambiguously and even against their will, the servants of imperialist ventures and their attendant outrages. Samoyol reveals that the time and shop-worn phrase traduttore, traditore has equivalents in numerous other languages, including Korean and Malgache, languages which have undergone intense pressure, putting it mildly, at the hands of colonial invaders. Chinua Achebe's classic description in Things Fall Apart of the indigenous messenger class relaying orders from the British colonial master to the about to be colonized Igbo is a case in point. At the same time, interpreters, fixers, and other intermediaries are seen as ultimately dispensable once their immediate usefulness has run out. It is significant that in the United States' recent hasty and ignominious retreat from the war on Afghanistan, actually defeat in the war on Afghanistan, many translators were left behind, whereas US-trained death squad commandos were allowed to escape. I might also add that Salman Rushdie didn't get killed by order of the fatwa. It was two of his translators who did, so this speaks to the prior panel, I think. Colonial languages like English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch have, in the name of their civilizing mission, run roughshod over local languages. In a sense, the publishing industry in advanced capitalist societies simply continues that bellicose process by other means. Writers from the so-called third world face pressure to write in the languages of their colonial oppressors. And while this certainly can be and has been an example of what the great Algerian Francophone writer Kateb Yassine called war booty, where the colonial language is permeated and hence transformed by the style and rhetoric of the formerly marginalized local language, it still tends to come at the expense of indigenous literacies. And Samoyol's book is very persuasive about that. She focuses on Moroccan literature, literature from the Kabyle and the Berbers that's just not to be found in translated form. Such is the power of the Euro-American market, even as the relative paucity of translated literature in the Anglophone world is rightfully criticized, countries whose publishing industries accord greater attention to translations still favor works written in majoritarian languages and hence actually contribute to the suppression of minor languages, which of course are hardly minor to their speakers. In this regard, it is revealing that the subtitle of the English language version of the Dictionary of Untranslatables is A Philosophical Lexicon, whereas the original French edition is careful to label it a European vocabulary of philosophy. Perhaps the location of the dictionary's added editors in US universities might account for this, but a glance at the table of contents indicates that the Euro focus remains largely intact. And all the change in subtitle does is to reassert the pseudo-universal primacy of European worldviews, notwithstanding the token appearance of a few Arabic terms. One is led to speculate about a truly American dictionary of untranslatables, which would bring in words from indigenous philosophies, from Black cultures, from creolized languages, etc. The ongoing work of the Ayuk Miche linguist and activist Yasnaya Elena Aguilar Gil, which appears regularly in the newspaper El País, is a contribution to this process. If it's an untranslatable you're looking for, let's consider the words funk and soul and fundamento and ashe and their philosophical implications. How would a phrase like, I got soul and I'm super bad be translated? Well, as Bob Marley said, who feels it knows it, but I digress. Samoyol cites the work of Martinican poet-philosopher Edouard Lisson as a way of thinking the imprévisibilité. That's a word that you can say unforeseeability, unpredictability, each is more or less accurate, but it's not quite the same. Imprévisibilité, the unforeseeability of the work of translation, which he considers essential to the development of an archipelagic thought. Translation, he says, invents a necessary language from one language to the other, common to both, but in some way unforeseeable in relation to each of them. It is not the content of the text that's translated, it is its poetics. This in turn has a bearing on the work of the Swiss sinologist Jean-François Billeter, who openly acknowledges the impossibility of really making adequate translations of classical Chinese poetry. He himself works on the Zhuangzi. He's done a lot of work about that, otherwise known as Chuangzi. In his case, he's doing the translation into French, of course, owing to the complete difference in both languages' resources. Quote, this is from Billeter, instead of insisting on translating, it's necessary to speak of the effects of the poem, of the event it produces in the mind of the reader. The poem would then be given an indirect presence, just as the poem itself gives an indirect presence to the real. He's talking about Tang Dynasty poetry specifically. He then projects himself to the extent possible into the poet's state of mind within lived moments as revealed on the page, constructing affective scenarios grounded in sensitivity to time, place, and cultural context that unpack the highly concentrated Chinese poetic idiom and open up these lived moments in all their dimensions, impossible necessity indeed, as well as an example of that opacity that Glissant promotes against a too facile transparency. If we can think of translation in terms of equity, as a dialogue between source and arrival languages, indeed as a debt the translator pays to the writer, then we should also consider the act of translation as potentially a reparative act, no less vital for being modest in view of the more profound reparations needed so that the notion of a shared humanity may become more than a rhetorical construct. The fight to preserve endangered languages is an integral part of this. Every language that is allowed to die out impoverishes all of us. Ideally, translators are among the most dedicated readers of their source texts, and as writers, they explore and make use of all the resources of their own languages and perhaps devise new such resources as they work through the obstacles of their chosen texts in the interest of rendering these texts justice. Justesse, also in French. And here perhaps is where the impossible element of translation, without of course vanishing entirely, nor should it, can be supplemented by new possibilities. Let us allow ourselves, with the help of some creative thinkers, a moment to speculate constructively, even in the face of mounting ignorance and imposed uniformity in a world beset by fire and flood and assorted monocultures, monolingualisms, monotones, monologues, monologues, monomanias. Edouard Glissant once declared, "I write in the presence of all the languages of the world," counterposing the tout monde, the all world, to the false unity of globalization. He refuses a hierarchy of languages, going beyond an easily acknowledged and just as easily dismissed plurality to asserting the precious quality of difference, not an irreconcilable difference that would seal off cultures from each other, but the opening of a common space in which differences cross-pollinate and, to paraphrase Glissant, change in the process of exchange without losing themselves. In his essay collection, Globalectics, Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls for a similar undermining of language hierarchies founded on, quote, the notion that some languages and cultures are inherently of a higher order than others, unquote. Advocating a network of cultures in dynamic exchange and equilibrium, of which his championing and practice of literature in African languages would be an integral element, Ngugi emphasizes the crucial role of the translator in bringing this about. Quote, translation is the language of languages. It opens the gate of national and linguistic prisons. It is thus one of the most important allies of world literature and global consciousness, unquote. A moving example of the generosity and openness to mutual discovery fostered by such an approach is founded in the late Zimbabwean author Charles Mungoshi's Shona translation of Ngugi's novel, A Grain of Wheat, Sangoye Mbewa. Mungoshi, I read this just last week in an online South African publication called New Frame, which I highly recommend. Mungoshi just passed away, and it was a tribute article to him. These are his words. I strongly felt Zimbabweans would easily identify with the experiences depicted in A Grain of Wheat, mainly because of the similarity of the colonial experiences of the two countries. People do not realize how similar our cultures are until they see it in A Grain of Wheat. Of course, much material is lost in the process, but if the original author communicates well, it helps the translator to live, important word, to live the work he is translating. Mungoshi's recognition that the relationship of the translator to the untranslatable text is a living one that emphasizes what is found in translation rather than what is inevitably and ultimately unimportantly lost. His words are especially poignant considering that Ngugi wrote A Grain of Wheat in English years before making the fateful decision to write his creative work in his Gikuyu mother tongue. I'm going to conclude here. If, as I mentioned earlier, Barbara Cassin's theory of translation gives primacy to languages in their multiplicity rather than the phenomenon of language tout court, Ngugi views translation as the unifying practice through which distinct languages can speak to and ultimately transform each other. His carceral metaphor is especially relevant in our era of mass incarceration and oppositional visions of an abolition democracy to come. To be monolingual and to affirm the fiction of a singular unified sociocultural identity is effectively to be imprisoned. Translation as language of languages has not only the potential to shatter the prison house of language, but to bring into the open air the languages of the prison houses everywhere. The Chilean poet of the early 20th century, Vicente Huidobro, in his long poem Altazor, declares, "Todas las lenguas están muertas, muertas en manos del vecino trágico." In Elliot Weinberger's translation, all the languages are dead, dead in the hands of the tragic neighbor, and calls for a simultaneously ludic and cataclysmic revival of the power of words. Y puesto que debemos vivir y no nos suicidamos, mientras vivamos juguemos el simple sport de los vocablos, de la pura palabra y nada más. And since we must live and not kill ourselves, as long as we live, let us play the simple sport of words, of the pure word and nothing more. Pura doesn't just mean pure, it can mean plain and simple, but you got to make choices here. Translation is an indispensable part of this world-changing, language-changing game, and it invites us to live up to our playful responsibility, to answer the call of the all world, and to establish our questing presence at once singular and multiple amidst the languages of the world, springing them loose from the bureaucratic, culture-cidal hands of the tragic neighbor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chris.
I think I kept to my time. That's good.
Thank you so much. So we do have one question for now. For anybody who wants to ask a question, please write them down in the chat room. The question is it's very much related to to the notion that you spoke of translation as being utilitarian. And if you could speak more, this question is from Lois Elaine Griffith. Mm-hmm. You could speak more about the relationship of translation and imperialism, which you did quite a bit, but if you can maybe just expand.
Well, I think it all began with Columbus, right? Where he said that, while he writes to Isabella la Católica and says, well, I'm going to,